a great class.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this class. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Birgit Koopsen. I'm a brand ambassador with Gelli Arts, and I'm in the Netherlands. And I'm happy to be here today to tell you all about using alcohol inks on the Gelli plate. So I think some people find it quite scary to use alcohol ink on the gel plate because they are permanent and people think that they might harm the plate, but that's absolutely not the case. The only thing that will happen is that the alcohol inks will stain your plate and it will never look like it looked before again, but it will not affect your prints. It will not affect your plate. It will not affect your future outcome of your prints. So it's totally safe to use it, but you have to be willing to live with a plate that looks a little bit differently. So I'm just going to show you how it works. So let's switch the camera to my hands. There we are. And so today I'm going to use my 5x7 Gelli Arts plate, and I'm going to show you exactly what I meant by the alcohol ink staining the plate. So this is one of my plates that I use with alcohol inks. And as you can see, it's completely yellow, like a bright yellow. And that's because of the pigments in the alcohol ink, and then especially the alcohol colors that contain yellow. And there is nothing you can do about it. You can not prevent this from happening, and you will also not be able to clean your plate and get the color off. But as I said, it will not affect your prints, so it's totally fine to work with a plate like this. The only thing is that if you, when you use other colors on a plate like this, and especially when you use translucent colors like alcohol inks, for instance, or when you work with ink pads that are translucent, then the color on your plate will look differently than it will turn out in your final print, because the yellow is kind of changing the colors on your plate. So obviously it will look as if there is yellow in your colors, but in the print it will not. There will not be yellow, but you will see all of that during the class. So I have a couple of plates dedicated to alcohol inks. So I try to keep my alcohol inks on dedicated plates, and also have a couple of plates for the prints I do with other products. And as I said, it's not because it would not work, but it's just because I like it when I work with my paints, that my plate is just translucent, and I get a better view on how the real colors are. But you could totally work with paint on these plates. And I actually have a third one here that was originally not meant to be used with alcohol inks, but sometimes I don't really think about what I'm doing, and I just put the alcohol ink on there before realizing that this was not my alcohol ink plate. So then I have an extra one for alcohol inks. And I probably will use all of them in this class, because alcohol ink needs a little bit of time to dry. And as we don't want to sit around and watch the alcohol ink dry, I will work on several plates. So I will do a technique on one plate, put it aside to dry, and then start a new technique on the next plate. And then later, when the ink has dried, I will come back to the one I did before. So I'm going to wear gloves, and I'm absolutely not a big fan of wearing gloves. I love to work with my hands without gloves and really feel what I'm working with, like the texture of paint, of the paper. I like to feel the grain of pencils or charcoal or whatever I'm working with, but the alcohol ink really stains your fingers and it's really hard to get it off. And then you need like cleaning alcohol to clean your hands, and then they get like really dry. So for this, only for this purpose, for alcohol inks, I will put on some gloves. And I'm going to work today with the Ranger Tim Holtz alcohol inks. They come in many colors, and I have 2 tins here. And if I'm right, these are actually also available at Michael's. So they are especially created to hold the bottles of alcohol ink. And so I have them in these tins. And this is only like a fraction of the colors that are available. These are just the normal alcohol colors, alcohol ink colors, but you also have like pearl colors that have like a little shine, and mixatives that you can mix with your normal alcohol colors and stuff like that. But today I'm just going to use the normal simple alcohol colors, and in a variety of colors. So I'm just going to put these out of the way, but accessible. And have my plate here. I'm also just going to use my normal Speedball rubber brayer to roll out the alcohol ink. And with the brayer, it's actually the same. So when you have a new brayer, a new soft rubber brayer, it looks about like this, a little bit or a little bit more like this. And you can totally get the alcohol ink off the brayer, but some colors will stain your brayer. So your brayer will get kind of all colors of the rainbow, but can still be used as before. So to clean my tools from alcohol ink, I use a rubbing alcohol or a cleaning alcohol like this. And of course, this is a Dutch one. I don't know the brands you have over there in the US or in Canada, but I think in America it's even more common to get than here in the Netherlands. And you probably all have some of it at home. I'm also going to use acrylic paint. And mostly when I work with alcohol ink, mostly a white acrylic paint. And I need the paint to pick up the alcohol ink from the plate, because alcohol ink needs to dry before you can pick it up, because it doesn't stay wet long enough to pick it up right away. Some parts like dry instantly, some parts stay wet a little bit longer. But the benefit of using alcohol inks on the plate is that you don't need special paper, you don't need Yupo paper. So you can print with alcohol on any paper you like, from cardstock to tissue paper to pattern paper, book paper, music paper, whatever paper you like, you can print on with alcohol inks, because you use that extra layer of paint. The paint picks up the alcohol ink and is basically between the paper and the ink. So the ink doesn't soak into the paper what it normally would do. And that's why it's such a fun thing to use on the gel plate, because then you don't have to use that plastic paper like Yupo paper to print on. And besides that, I'm going to use a couple of tools that I will just show when I'm ready for it. And then I will explain what I do with them. So let's just start with the first technique. And the first technique is a really, really simple one, but also a really cool one. At least that's what I think. Using alcohol ink with cling plastic. I think that's what it's called in English, or cling film. I'm not sure. So this is to wrap food, like it's on. Let me see. And you probably all have it also in your kitchen, like on a roll, just a normal cling plastic. And as you can see, I have used this one before, also with alcohol ink. And I'm just going to use it again. And because there's also already some color on it, and alcohol ink reactivates itself. So when you have dried alcohol ink and you put new alcohol ink on it, or like the cleaning alcohol, for instance, it will reactivate. It's the only way to get alcohol inks wet again is to add more alcohol. So what will happen is when I use a sheet of cling film that already has some ink on it, the ink will reactivate and transfer to the plate. So if I am going to use totally different colors now on the plate than I have on my cling plastic, I will still get some traces of these colors in my print because it just transfers to the plate. And what I really like about the cling film is that you can create a beautiful frosty effect. And I'm just going to use, I think I will also use some frosty colors because I don't know about your area in the world where you are, but here it's still quite warm for the time of year, even though it's supposed to be fall already. We have temperatures from over 20 degrees, which is a lot. I have no idea, by the way, what that would be in Fahrenheit, but it's still warm. But we are approaching fall and winter, of course. So I think frosty prints are really fun. Maybe you can even use them like in your Christmas cards or something like that, your holiday cards. You might get some ideas. So I will just add drops of these colors on my plate. And don't be too, let me see, I don't know the word right now. Let's say don't be too frugal. I don't know if that's the way to say it, but make sure you use enough ink to keep it wet until you are ready to apply the texture to it. And somehow on the plate this all looks the same color, and it's definitely not. They are all different colors, so we'll see how that turns out. I'm just going to add some denim. I mean, that's like really a different color. And then I'm going to use my brayer and spread the ink, but I can't like really roll out the ink because I will then just move all of the ink to one side. So I'm kind of like putting down my brayer and lightly move it around like this. And if it dries too much to my liking before I'm able to apply my texture, then I can always apply more alcohol ink, because the ink that's already on there and that is already dry will just get reactivated, and it will be fine. So you can just add more ink. You can even add more colors if you like to. If you're like, when you spread the colors, you feel like you would have liked more colors, then you can just add more colors. And I'm curious if yes, I put the side down that has some ink already on it. So I'm just going to put this aside and hope that I put enough ink on there. And I have to let it dry, because if I would pick up the cling film right now, then I would just lose the texture that it's creating, because as long as the ink is wet, it will keep moving. and it will only stay in the position where you want it once it's dry. So you have to leave the texture on there until it's dry, because otherwise it's just going to float and move, and you will lose the texture. So we're leaving the cling film on there, and we're just going to do another technique. And I'm going to try and do one that doesn't need as much drying time, because you can imagine underneath the cling film, it takes a longer time to dry than when it would be in open air. So I'm going to create a pattern using a pill strip like this. And you have pill strips in many sizes and shapes, and with and without some texture in what's on the back. I have a lot of them. I've collected a lot of them. I always ask my family to collect them for me, and as you can see, they all are different. They have different sizes. I have little circles, but also more like oval shape. This is a totally different one with a totally different pattern, and so there are many of them, and I have a drawer full of these, and I'm just going to use these two. They are really great to create texture, and they are for free, at least if you need them anyway, right? So it's not like you go and buy some medicine for the packaging. At least that would be a little bit weird. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to spread again some color on my plate, and I'm going to do a combination of a Laguna and some kind of pink. Let me see, what is this? This one is empty. I have raspberry here. Laguna and raspberry looks like a fun combination. And I'm just going to add lines.
Birgit, and where a quick question. Hi.
Yes.
How should we clean the plates between uses when using just acrylic paint? What do you like to do?
What I like to do is not clean them at all, because I really like the remains of, if there is any paint left on the plate in a previous print, I like it when the remains show up in a future print, so they are not so clean, and you have like this little bit of extra texture, extra color, or a little bit of a distressed look. I really like that. So I hardly ever clean my plate in between prints, but if I do, I usually use a wet cloth or a baby wipe. And if it's like really dirty and I can't really get it really clean, then I use a little bit of baby oil or vegetable oil and a paper towel, and then clean it like that. But you can also decide to use paint to clean your plate. In that case, if there's, for instance, a lot of paint left on your plate and you want to clean it, you can decide to use a solid layer of paint to pull up all of the leftover paint from the plate. So you add a very, very thin layer of acrylic paint, you put the paper on there, you leave it on there to dry, and then when the paint is completely dry, you pull up the paper, and then your plate is clean, and usually you get a really fun textured print with a lot of leftover color from your previous print, maybe even some texture or pattern if you used a stencil or any texture tool. And a lot of times that cleanup paper can be used very well for instance, as a background for an art journal page or for a card or something like that. So I try to clean my brayer, as you can see, on a sheet of scrap paper. And but not all of the ink comes off. That means that if I would use my brayer again with new ink, then the ink on the brayer will also reactivate, which means that this color would also end up on my plate with new colors. If I don't want that, I can take a piece of paper towel, and the cleaning alcohol and clean my brayer before using it with new colors. So if you don't want the colors to mix, then you have to clean your tools, so like your brayer, but also, for instance, if you would work with stencils, you would also have to clean your stencil before you use it with new colors, because the old colors that have dried on your stencil will reactivate when you put it on the plate again. So here I have a thin layer of alcohol ink, and I'm not sure, I'm just going to click away the chat for a moment, because I was wondering, it's not like really shiny on the ink, is it? It's okay. You can see it, I think. This doesn't work with gloves. Let me see if I can get the chat again. So here we are. So I want to use these pill strips, and in order to do that, I need to apply the alcohol ink to my pill strips. And of course, you can imagine that it would not work if this one is very dirty. Let me clean that. You can imagine that I can't just take off the lid and just pour it onto my pill strip. So this is why I wear gloves. You can probably tell that that was a good idea. So I'm actually in a room. I have a window open, and I'm not going to use a heat gun or anything like that while I'm using these, because a heat gun cannot be used on the gel plate. But if you work for a long time with alcohol inks in a not so well ventilated room, and you're using a heat gun to dry alcohol ink or to move alcohol inks on your Yupo paper or something like that, you should actually also wear a mask, because the damp in the alcohol inks is not like really healthy. So that's something that you should consider if you use this a lot and you can't open a window and you also want to use your heat gun, for instance. So I want to add another color. Maybe also green, I don't know. I'm just going to start with the yellow one. I want to apply this honeycomb to my pill strip, and therefore I'm using a piece of cut and dry foam. So if I'm explaining it right, I'm sorry, I just have to sorry. If I'm right, this is actually meant to create your own stamp pad. So you can, it comes in like larger sheets, and you can cut it up and you can apply stamping inks to it, and then you create your own stamp pad. But you can also cut it up and use it as a sponge for all kinds of creative techniques, and I'm using it to apply my alcohol ink to my tool, in this case the pill strip. So I'm adding, and you can also use what's it called, Ranger has those blending tools. So you have a little wooden thingy where you can put some felt shapes on, and you can also use them for blending stamping inks, but you can also use them for alcohol inks. But I like to use these cut and dry foam. So as you can see, I hope you can see it, I create a texture in the dried alcohol ink on my plate. So if there's a lot of ink on my tool and it's really wet, what happens when I put it down and I lift it up, it's going to be really wet. And as I said, it's as long as it's wet, it will move around. So you can see that it's like the circles are not like really crisp. They don't have like a crisp outline. They move a little bit, which I really like an organic look. If your ink is almost dried, as you can see it here, or if you have less ink and it's almost dry, your outlines will be sharper and the ink will move less. What actually happens,
Birgit.
yeah.
Hi, just to interrupt you very quickly, can you please repeat the name of the foam stamps you're using, the exact name for that?
It's called cut and dry foam.
Okay,
and I'm pretty sure Michael sells it. It's
awesome.
also, I think it's also from Ranger, actually. I'm not really sure about that, but I think it's also from Ranger.
Okay, I'll try to find the link and share for everyone in the comments.
Okay. Let me think what I wanted to say. Oh yeah, what actually happens when you apply a new color of ink in ink that's already dry is that the new color kind of pushes the color that's already there aside. So where you would think a lot maybe about the color wheel when you work with acrylic paint on the plate, because you don't want to create mud on the plate. So you would think about not mixing yellow and purple, for instance, because that would create mud. You don't have to think about that so much when you use alcohol ink, at least when you use it this way, because the new color is just pushing aside the color that's already there. So it's not mixing. It's only mixing when both of them are wet. But if one of them is already dry and you put a new one in there, then it just pushes it aside and kind of creates its own space. And that's why you also see, of course, the pattern, because it's not mixing and just creating a new layer in a new color, but it's actually kind of removing the ink that's already there, if that makes any sense.
Birgit, we had another comment. Will you see the colors when you press on the paper? They were saying they don't really see the colors you were putting on the masks and pill covers.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah. Will you see the colors when you press down onto the paper? They were saying they just don't really see them when you were putting them on the masks and the pill covers.
Yes, of course. So, well, if I put paper on, I hope I understand the question. If I would put paper on it now, you will not see it because it's dry and it will not transfer to the paper. only there where it's still a little bit wet, but nothing is happening. But when I use paint to pick it up, and especially when I use white paint, they will just keep their original color. So if I would, for instance, because they are very translucent, so if I would, for instance, use a blue color, a dark blue color now to pick this up, then you would lose most of the color, because the translucency is not, the colors are not strong enough to show up on a dark blue background, for instance. But if I use white, they just keep their original color, and I will just show you how it works. So this is dry. As you can see, I can touch it. If I would do this with my without gloves, I would actually pick up some of the ink, because it will stick to your skin, but it doesn't when I have my gloves on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to roll out some paint to pick up my inks. And I am going to roll out the paint on a sheet of paper instead of on my gel plate. Because if I would, my brayer, the rubber of my brayer is a little bit sticky, kind of like your skin. It is a little bit different than when you use gloves. So if I would just roll it out straight away on the plate, there is a chance that the ink will stick to my brayer and it will just be lifted up by the brayer. I don't want that to happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to roll out the paint on my scrap paper and make sure that my brayer is completely covered with paint all around. So when I touch my plate, the ink is not touching my brayer, but only touching paint. And then I'm going to roll out a thin layer of paint and place my paper on top. So there are two ways to do it. You can either make sure that your layer of paint is like really, really thin, and you can just lift up the paper right away, and it will pick up all of the alcohol ink. But if your layer of paint is a little bit too thick, then there is a chance that the paper only picks up the top layer and is not also picking up the ink that's underneath. So if you want to make sure that you pick up everything from the plate, if you're not sure that your layer of paint is thin enough, then you just leave your paper on until everything is dry. And it doesn't matter how long you leave it on, as long as it is completely dry. If it's not completely dry, but it's like half dry, then the chances are that when you pick up the paper, that the paper tears, because in some areas it will be stuck to the plate, and in some areas it will. It's mostly because the paper is wet and it's not strong enough to pull up the paint. So either you do it right away, or you leave it to dry, because if the paint soaks into the paper and it's like not completely dry, you have a bigger chance that your paper will tear. So I'm just going to leave this for a minute to dry completely, and I'm just going to come back to my cling film and see if this is dry. And how can I see if it's dry? Well, usually when you touch the cling film and you see the ink moving underneath, then it means that it's not dry. And when I push down the cling film here, then I see the ink moving, which means that not all of the ink is dry yet. So I'm just going to leave it a little bit longer, and I'm just going to trust that this is dry enough and just pick it up. And usually, actually, alcohol ink pulls really easy from the plate. There are a lot of products that are much harder to pull from the plate, but alcohol actually pulls from the plate really easily. And as you can see, all of the ink came off. It's nice and yellow again. And here I have my print with the different alcohol colors.
Birgit, that looks gorgeous. We were wondering, have you found that white tends to be the best color to use for the alcohol ink technique, or do you have another color that you also like?
I have, of course, everybody has their own favorite colors. And I have my favorite colors, but all of the colors actually work really good on the alcohol ink. There are just some colors of some yellow colors that work a little bit less well, and probably I mean, I'm not a scientist and I'm not sure if that's the case, but because the yellow somehow stains the plate so much, I have the feeling that the pigments kind of go into the plate and then are not being picked up with the paint. So there are especially some of the lighter yellow colors, and also something like, for instance, something like this, a citrus with a green with a lot of yellow in it, that doesn't really show up so well in your prints. But other than that, you can actually use any color. And yeah, as you can see, as I said, because the new color kind of pushes aside the previous color, you don't there's not a lot of you don't really have to be afraid that you create mud, so you can experiment with all kinds of colors actually. And I can't say that enough, when you're gel printing, whether it's with alcohol ink or with acrylic paint or what else can you use? You can use all kinds of stuff like water-soluble crayons or pen pastel or whatever you use on the plate. Do a lot of experimenting, because that's the only way to find out. I mean, watching a video from somebody doing a specific technique on the plate and then try it once and then say it doesn't work for me, that's not how it is. Gel printing is really about experimenting and trying again and trying again. And sometimes some techniques are not like you get them like right away, but once you do get them, they are so worth the effort and the trying, that I really encourage you to keep trying at least more than 1 or 2 times, because it only gets better, really. I still don't dare picking this one up, so I'm just going to do another one and hope that that one also dries before my time is up. I want to show you also that you can print on tissue paper with alcohol inks, and I want to use a stencil. So let me see, I have some tissue paper here. Is this big enough? It's big enough. And my stencil fell on the floor. Here it is. Here I have a stencil, and alcohol ink is really fun to use with stencils. And this is maybe not exactly the right size. This will work. So this stencil is also from Gelli Arts, and also available through the Michaels website. And I can't access the Michaels website because I'm in Europe and I'm not really sure how it works, but I think you buy it from Blick and then but you buy it through the Michaels website. But I think Dominic actually put a link in the chat so you can find it.
Before we get started on this, we did have 2 more questions if you want to go through them.
Okay.
So our first question was, can you use the foam pads repeatedly, but only with the same colors? Otherwise, they will transfer?
Yeah, that's exactly right, because that's the same as when you put it on the plate. it will reactivate when you put new alcohol ink on it. And that means that if you have like a purple on your foam and you put a yellow on it, then of course the yellow will not show because it will mix with the reactivated purple, and you will get like, and then you will get like a muddy color. But what I really like about these is that you get like a sheet. I think they are 8 by 10, and you can cut them up. So you have a bunch of these, and you can just dedicate them to a specific color. And you know, I use all kinds of yellow on one yellow foam. I'm not so concerned about it, but if you want to, you could actually put a little sticker with the color on the back and then use them for one color especially. But even with one sheet, you will get a whole bunch that you can use over and over and over again, because it's not like with acrylic paint, it's not the foam is not getting like hard. So, or how do you say it? Stiff or hard. So when acrylic paint dries, it turns into a kind of plastic, and that's not what doesn't happen with alcohol ink. So you can use them many times, but you just have to use them with the same color.
And Birgit, you agree that the other paint colors change the brightness of the colors. For example, if you're using black, it will make the other colors look darker?
But only if you mix them, because if you use them, if you would, for instance, use black as your base color, oh, you mean the acrylic paint colors?
Yes, can you just confirm in the comments if that's what you were referring to?
Yes, because you can't really see it here, because it's quite covered. But in the little open areas, you see white, and that's not because my paper is white, it's because my paint was white, because between the alcohol ink and the paper, there's this layer of paint that I use to pick up the ink from the plate. So in these areas, if I would have used another color, for instance, yellow, then these areas, the white areas, would be yellow, but also the blue would look green, because the blue is so thin and so translucent that if it would be on top of yellow, it would look green. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's do this one before our time is up. And I'm just going to do it very simple with 2 colors. And of course, you can always experiment with a bunch of colors, and the place where you put your colors, there's also a little bit of color left on my brayer that might reactivate, but I want. So I can put my stencil straight into the wet ink, and it will give a little bit of a different effect than when I put it into dry ink. Oops, that was my tissue paper. I have another one. But I will explain the difference, but I'm going to use the stencil on a dried alcohol ink because we don't have that much time. And with the stencil, it would work the same as with the cling film, that the ink that's underneath the stencil takes more time to dry than the ink that's not underneath the stencil. So that's why I'm going to work with dried ink for this technique. Also, when the ink is still wet, when you put your stencil on top, part of that ink will stick to your stencil. And then when you remove it from the plate, the color, you actually kind of pick up the color. And if you add another color on top, that color is kind of pushing away the color that's underneath. So you won't see a lot of the color that you put on there originally. If you put your stencil on dry ink, it will not be picked up by the stencil because dry ink cannot be pulled from the plate. I hope that that makes sense, which means that the color will stay underneath the stencil, even if I put other colors on top. So I'm just waiting for the ink to dry, which goes quite quickly. There we go. That should be like dry, or at least almost dry. Dry enough. Now I'm going to put the stencil on top. And push it down a little bit so it kind of sticks to the plate. Yeah, it's not completely dry, but we'll just go with it. And I push it down, and now I can add a different color in the open areas. And the new color will, as I told before, push the existing color aside. So you get like darker colors around the edges of the open areas, and you get the new color in the middle. So I'm just going to take that pool, and I'm just going to drip that into the open areas. And depending on how much I put in there, of course, it goes all the way to the edges of the open areas, or it doesn't go all the way. Also, where the stencil is not completely touching the plate, it will go underneath the plate. So it will also do something with the ink that's underneath the stencil. And you will see it when I lift it up later. And it's very unpredictable, but you can't really like predict where the ink is going and where it's not going, because it's so fluid and you have no control. But the only thing you will know for sure is that when you lift up the stencil, you will have the texture or the pattern of the stencil in your final print. So if you think there's too much ink, or if you want it to dry a little bit faster, you can just use a paper towel and dab away some of that ink. And now, of course, it has to dry again. That's also why I have several gel plates for alcohol ink, because when I'm not teaching this, but I'm just doing this for myself, I also don't want to sit around and wait for the ink to dry. So I want to keep working, and I want to work on several plates at the same time. So because as you can see, when you do a technique like this with the cling film, it really takes a long time before it's dry. I sometimes, when I want to use this, like the frosty look or something like that, I just put the ink on there and the cling film, and I just leave it there overnight, and I come back the next day and then I remove the cling film, and I will be sure that it's all completely dry. And then I have another plate that I can work on in the meantime. So it looks to me that this is almost dry, maybe not completely dry, but it's not wet, so wet anymore that it will start running. So I'm just going to go with it and just pull it up and hope that it that the texture is dry enough to actually show in the print. It is still a bit tricky. Not sure how this will work out in the final print, but at least you will know how to do it, and then hopefully you are more patient or you have more time than me when you try it for yourself, and the results might be better.
Birgit, Vic was asking, couldn't you use the foam pad to apply the ink over the stencil?
Yeah, you can absolutely do that, but you get a different effect because now the new ink is kind of pushing the old ink aside, which will give you darker lines, darker outlines in the open areas from the original color that you put on the plate. And when you use the foam to apply the ink, you're actually kind of mixing the existing ink with the new color on your foam, because the foam is wet and the ink on your plate is reactivating. So you won't get those the difference between the two colors will not be that big, if that makes any sense. I don't really know how to say that, but you don't get those outlines because you kind of soften it with your foam, and you're kind of like mixing those colors, so you don't get that that difference. I hope I explained that. Sometimes it's so hard to find the right words, but I hope you all understand my poor English. Okay, so I'm just going to apply paint again, and as before, I'm just going to roll it out on a piece of paper so I can make sure that it's not that I'm not touching the ink with my brayer. And I'm not saying that it's always happening that your brayer sticks to your ink, but just to be sure, it's better to make it a habit to roll out your paint not on the plate but on a sheet of paper. It's especially when the ink is not like completely dry that that it sticks to the brayer. If it's completely dry, then usually it is okay, but yes, I'm using the 5x7 plate, and thank you. I'm doing my best, so I'm just going to pick it up straight away. I'm just going to trust that my layer of paint was thin enough, and I think it actually worked. Yeah, that worked. So that's what I meant with the frosty look. And so you can tell, at least I can tell, that in these areas here, the ink was not completely dry and it looks a little bit fuzzy. Because when I pulled up the cling film, it moved a little bit. It was just a little bit, but it just moves enough to lose those really sharp lines. But if you look very closely, let me see, if I hope it's sharp. If you look here very closely in these areas where the ink was completely dry, you see that you get these like really sharp outlines, which gives that like frosty look, as if it's ice, right? So if I would have taken a little bit more time before lifting up the cling film, that would also have happened here in these areas, and that would have looked way better than it looks now. But I'm sure you can imagine the results you could get when you leave it just there for like overnight or something. Okay, it's almost time, and I hope this one is dry enough to pick up and show you what it looks when you use a stencil with alcohol ink. I'll just have to go for it, right? Just hoping that it's enough, good enough. because, as I said, some of the ink also goes underneath the stencil, and that's especially what happened here. And underneath the stencil, it needs more time to dry. So when you lift up the stencil, then sometimes this also starts moving, running, floating again. But I think it's pretty okay, even though it's not completely dry. It's not like really moving anymore. But yeah, as you can see, you can totally see the texture of the stencil. And this is what I meant with the color. So this looks really weird. I used only a light blue, like pool, and some kind of raspberry or magenta or something like that. And still you see that yellow color because of the translucency and the open areas. And it kind of messes with your mind because the outcome will look very different than this. And that's also when I do my reels, for instance, for Instagram, then people are like, this is a different print. You didn't pick up what you put on the plate because it looks so different. But there's nothing I can do because there's no way of not having a yellow plate when you use alcohol inks. You'll just have to live with it. A little bit more paint. And I'm just going to apply and hope it's dry enough. It looks good. Because if the ink is not completely dry, it does two things when you apply the paint. First of all, you will lose the texture, at least part of the texture, because you're just rolling it away with the paint. If the ink is still wet, and also the ink is going to mix with your I was supposed to pick this up with tissue paper. Oh, that's too bad. But I have some printed tissue paper, so I can show you. Secondly, it mixes with the paint if it's not completely dry, and your background color will not be the original color of the paint, but it will be a mixture of the paint color you used and the alcohol ink you used. But this is my print on just regular card. And as you can see, you get a very different outcome than when you would have do this with acrylic paint. It is more organic. It's more uncontrolled. The colors are more translucent. So it's just totally different than acrylic paint. And I really like working with alcohol ink, but that is very, very personal. But I also have some tissue paper here on which I printed with alcohol ink. So as you can see, this is it looks practically the same as printing on just normal paper. But tissue paper is so much thinner that it is perfect for collage, what I really like, and especially with the translucency of the alcohol ink. So for instance, this one I didn't pick it up with acrylic paint, but I actually picked it up with matte medium. And matte medium is translucent, which means that if there are any open areas, you will not change the color of open areas, so it will just have the color of the paper. And the areas where there is ink, if you put it on a different sheet of paper using a matte medium, so you're using it as collage material, then it will keep its translucency. So this one is translucent, where this one has the white layer in between. It's printed on pink tissue paper, by the way. Maybe it's better to show this one. So this is white tissue paper, and there's a layer of white paint in between. This is white tissue paper, but I used matte medium to pick it up, which means that the colors stay translucent. So if I put this on another sheet of paper as collage material, this is what happens. So this part was actually originally here. So it's this part of my print. And I applied it with matte medium on a yellow background, and all the open areas, like the white areas, little spaces here, they turn translucent because I used matte medium, and I see the original color of my background paper. So that's the difference when you use paint or matte medium. And I could talk at least another hour about using alcohol ink on the plate, because you can also do fun stuff with cookie cutter shapes, for instance, like this. You can play with cotton buds to create little spots in different colors on your background. You can play with rings using little glasses and lids and drip with the alcohol ink. So there are many more things you can do with alcohol ink. I have done Michael's classes about alcohol inks before. I also have done videos for Gelli Arts about alcohol ink on the jelly plate. So if you want to know more about using alcohol ink on the jelly plate, then just go check them out, and especially experiment, and just play. Let me see real quick. I hope Zoom is not going to kick us out. I'm just going to look real quick at the last couple of questions, if there are any questions.
Okay, you're okay to go just a few minutes over.
Okay. Okay, so there are a couple of questions that I don't know. I'm not familiar with the Yupo paper, and vellum. You can definitely use it on vellum. All kinds of paper and plastic you can print on. So, and I'm sometimes scanning the prints, but mostly I forget, and I just use them in my work. And I really have to end this class, unfortunately. I hope you enjoyed it and you learned something new, and I really hope to see you again in my next class, and that's already next week, and I'm going to print with yarn and thread, and I hope to see you there. So have a wonderful day and see you next week, hopefully. Bye.